to In the Zooms of Recovery, and this is an exploration of online recovery during COVID-19. So I just want to note our research team. I have a graduate student, Matthew Meeks, who's been helping with this project and has been instrumental. I also have Dr. Kendall Susi, also at the University of Windsor. And I also have some collaborators who've helped out. Austin Brown, who's a graduate student at Syracuse, Dr. McKillop at McMaster, and then Dr. Brandon Bergman at Harvard University. And they have all been helpful in conceptualizing and putting together this project and in various ways. So today, the presentation is grouped into different parts. So first, I'm going to talk about just briefly touch on the history and some of the previous research on online recovery. And then I'm going to go into detail about what the study entails and what we were looking at. And then I'm going to touch on some of the early insights. And I say early insights and preliminary findings because we are midway through this study. This is actually the first time that I've presented on any of this data or the study more generally. So we do have insights, some quantitative, some qualitative, but it still is pretty early, and we will have much more data and much more higher level sophisticated analysis coming, and I can give you information about when and where you can find that in the future. Okay, so some quick background about this topic. I'm going to do a brief overview of 12-step programs. I assume that many of you, if not all of you, know what they are and what the basis of 12-step programs are, but I'm going to touch on that just to clarify, and then I'll touch on online recovery, go into previous research, and then talk about the development. 12-step programs are peer support programs. They are built on the idea of one person helping another, largely focused on personal growth, on spirituality, and on social relationships. And there's been quite a bit of work done by Dr. Kelly, also at Harvard, that has looked at the behavioral mechanisms, so how change occurs among people in these programs. And he's found that a lot of the changes are social, they're cognitive, and they're affective. And what this means is there's a big shift in social networks, increase in coping skills, increased psychological well-being, and there is this decrease in impulsivity and in craving. And we know that prior to COVID, there were over 71,000 AA, specifically Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous meetings happening in the United States and Canada alone. So this is just those two countries. And that for AA specifically, there was a 900% increase in the availability of online meetings in 1 month time. So this is a period of time from April to May. And we do know that in NA, there was a similar increase, but they did not have exact numbers when we contacted them. It should be noted, however, that online recovery is not a new concept. It's not something that just got started when COVID-19 hit, right? There's a massive explosion of availability and options, but in fact, it's been occurring and in existence for well over 20 years. And one of the ways that we know that is in the 3rd edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, which was published in the early 2000s, there's actually a quote, there's a line in the foreword that talks about whether meetings are happening face-to-face or modem to modem. And so that is a pretty strong indication that they were happening at that point of publication, which dates it back even several years prior to that. So it's been happening for quite some time. And we know that the people who were using online recovery spaces most often and frequently, as reported by the Alcoholics Anonymous World Services, were actually people who are known as loners or internationalists. So loners are people who don't have 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous in their local area, And then internationalists are people who are like merchant marines, or people who spend a significant amount of time traveling, or in the case of the merchant marines, on a ship for 6 months out of a year. So largely accessed by these two demographics and a few others, but this was predominantly who was accessing the online recovery space up until March of this year. And in a general sweep of research on recovery and online spaces, what I found is that they were very often focused on specific platforms. So on platforms like In the Rooms, which is a web-based online meeting space. So there has been some work that has looked at accessibility and efficacy of that particular platform. And then similarly, the She Recovers, which is not necessarily a program, but it's more a social support platform designed for women. So there's been some work on that. There's been a lot of other studies that have looked at things like moderation, LifeRing and some of the other recovery programs that have heavy online components. And a lot of the focus here was, as I said, online efficacy of these programs, but there was also some look at generational differences. I did find a few studies that looked at that. But the problem with this previous work is that people self-selected into the use of these online programs. And so the current situation has really left us with an opportunity to look at people who didn't necessarily choose to be in an online recovery space, but were forced by the circumstances, which was not possible before, right? It's not exactly ethical to, for the purposes of research, tell someone they can't access their face-to-face recovery support and that they need to just do online for obvious reasons. And in the previous work and in the recovery science literature more generally, there's a heavy focus on a couple of different measures that I'll talk about in this with relation to this project as we use them for our purposes. One of those is recovery capital. So that's the breadth and depth of resources that people have and that they can draw upon in order to sustain their recovery. And then 12-step affiliation and practices. So this is how much someone feels like they're connected to the principles of the 12-step program that they're a part of. And so how much their actions, their beliefs, their experiences are in alignment with 12 steps. And so the conceptualization of this study, you know, what happened for me, and I should have given this disclaimer, but I'm also, in addition to being a researcher and being really interested in recovery science, I'm also a person in long-term recovery for 15 years now. And so when the social distancing mandates took place, there was an initial push for me to sort of assess what needed to happen in the local community, the recovering community, and then respond to those needs. I was familiar with online technology. I knew a lot of people were not. And so some of the things that I did in the local community really contributed to me getting a better understanding of what was happening for people and what the challenges were. And that really sparked a much greater interest in taking a look at this and creating this study. So I put some of our meetings online in this local area. I helped educate others. I created a directory of online meetings happening in this area. And then I was also part of an online, a virtual group that started on social media, on Facebook in particular, and that grew exponentially. And under a week, it went from 0 members to about 40,000 members. And a lot of the moderating that I was doing on that site really gave me pause to think, like, this is a major development. And I don't know that I was worried necessarily about Alcoholics Anonymous per se, or I was really just interested about what impact it would have on people's recovery trajectories over the course of time. And so that my efforts to stabilize the recovery community and the people around me really led to a deeper desire to want to have more answers. And I didn't really see it happening. And so I started putting together a team that I just described to you. So I asked people to come on board, and then we pushed we submitted an ethics application, and that was approved in April, and we began collecting data immediately. And we went forward with this project with 4 primary aims, right? So this is it's a longitudinal study. It is largely exploratory. So we didn't go in with any specific hypotheses. It was more like, here are the things that we're interested in. We're going to gather as much data as we can and see what's going on. And so one of the first aims was, what sort of changes will we see in recovery outcomes depending on online recovery use? So number of meetings people are attending, for example. And then we also wanted to know what recovery factors, what personality factors, what level of use, whether or not those things would predict better mental health and recovery outcomes. And I am also just largely interested in gender differences. And we also wanted to look at age differences. So if there were cohort effects, generational effects in the use of online recovery support. And then I wanted to also capture from the perspective of the participants, what some of the benefits and the challenges were of this shift to online spaces. And so I do have some qualitative responses in their own words, people describing what they found that they liked most and least about the online recovery space, among some other general questions that were asked. Okay, so to give you a bit of details about the study and the specifics of the study, our sample included 322 12-step fellowship members. 57% of them were female, so it's a little bit more women than typically we would see in a 12-step population, where the balance is typically between 30-70 or 60-40, with usually more men. So it was a little heavy on the female side. The mean age was 44. They generally went to about 4 meetings per week. And I should mention that this was on average across the 4 data points that we collected. I do have another slide that talks about changes in average meeting attendance, which is interesting, but this was done across 4 time points. And the range of time in recovery was from 1 day to 48 years, with a pretty big standard deviation, meaning there was a wide range of time in recovery. And unfortunately, as is the case with a lot of recovery samples, that was predominantly Caucasian. And this maps directly onto the Alcoholics Anonymous World Services demographic breakdown for race and ethnicity, and which is typically about 90%. And this is even with targeting recruitment strategies that were aimed towards gathering data from minorities. Our participants were primarily from the United States. There was a portion of them that were from Canada as well. We did have a small representation from the UK and some from Australia. And then we had some participants that either did not disclose, or they were from, there were a few people randomly, like one from India, one from Cyprus, random areas. So this is a breakdown of the participants and their length of time in recovery. So you can see we have a spread across the ages. So here, age in recovery, length of time in recovery. So here on the axis on the left-hand side is the number of participants in the study, and the bars represent the length of time in recovery in years. So about 40 people had less than 1 year, and the 1 to 4 year grouping had just over 100, followed by 5 to 9 years, 10 to 19, and there were quite a few, just over 40 or almost 50 people who had 20 or more years. So this is a sample of people who were pretty well established in their recovery. That was what I had access to for this study. And I would have really liked to have seen more people with 1 year or less, but that is not the way that it turned out. But it is an interesting question, and I'm collaborating and working with people at the Homewood Research Institute to get more answers about the impact of this situation on people who are in earlier recovery. So I've been using the term 12-step membership loosely. They're primarily reported being in Alcoholics Anonymous, a small portion reported being in Narcotics Anonymous. I think it was about 12%. And then there was another portion that reported an other 12-step program. And from what I saw, a lot of those were Cocaine Anonymous and other subtypes of substance use disorder. And then an interesting part of the sample is that there were a pretty large proportion of people who identified as LGBTQ two-spirit. And you know, I'm not exactly sure why we have such a large representation. I think it's great. I'm looking forward to digging a little deeper into this. Definitely appreciate that there's diversity within the sample. But this is about double what I usually see. I collect samples like this pretty often. And so I'm not sure if maybe being online has something to do with it, or just in the places that I recruited from, which I'll tell you about in just a moment. But this was a pretty interesting aspect in terms of demographics of the sample. And then with regard to education, we had many of our participants had at least some college or some college degree. So the pink here is doctoral, the green is a master's level, the gray is a bachelor's degree, and then the blue is an associate's degree, and then yellow high school or GED equivalent. Okay, so about the study specifically, so recruitment was largely done through Facebook campaigns, Facebook marketing campaigns. And then through that, I used snowball sampling to try to reach out to other folks in recovery. But we also did do a blast on Facebook recovery groups. So these are social media groups that are specific for people in recovery, and they're usually done around interests, or sometimes it's just a general group. And then we did put everyone in the study into a raffle anyone who wanted to be in this raffle for $50 Amazon gift cards. And there were 4 of those at each time wave for waves 1 and 2. And then we compensated participants with, I think it was $5 and then $10 for the last 2 waves to try to increase our response rates. And so the marketing campaigns were directed at people who were living in the top 4 English-speaking countries in the world. So the US and Canada, the UK and Australia. So the 4 countries that the participants came from. And then they were also targeted for people that had shared interests. So if people indicated or had liked or had listed as one of their interests anything to do with recovery, so like clean and sober, or Bill and Bob, or there were a lot of different terms that we used. I think there were a total of 10. But then this ad, or a variation of this ad, I actually edited it so that the Friends of Bill W. part wasn't on the actual ad, but this is generally what people saw. And then they clicked on it, and that took them right to the survey. And I should also state that this is not an actual screen of a meeting happening. This is a stock image that I found online. I had people messaging me. They were angry that I was posting images of recovery meetings. That wasn't the case. Okay. So the survey itself consisted of a baseline measure where we determined whether or not people were qualified to be in the study. And by that, I just mean they were at least 18 and they identified as being a member of a 12-step program. And then we collected a bunch of demographic information. They had a battery of measures that assess different recovery processes and a host of other things that I'll go over in a minute. And then it also included covariates, so things like positive and negative affect. Personality was one of the other ones we collected. And the waves were distributed up until this point in 1 month intervals. So we did a baseline measure. I think I actually have a timeline. Here we go. We did a baseline data collection in late April. Wave 2 was late May, followed by June and end of July into August, which was wave 4. That's where we currently sit. So we're right in the midway point of this study. And these are just a list of the measures that are used that I will go into in more detail in just a moment. So we were interested primarily in a lot of different recovery outcomes. Some of those were recovery capital. Some of the others were hoping and coping in recovery. And to give you a bit more info about what those measures are and what they look like, I've pulled some basic information about the measures here for you. So the name of the measure is on the left. The number of items is in the second column. Sample item from that measure is listed. And this one is, I regard my life as challenging and fulfilling without the need for using drugs or alcohol. Participants rated each of the 10 items on the scale from 1, strongly disagree, to 6, strongly agree. And I do have the actual measure and all of the items on the measure as supplemental files. So if there are questions after and people want to see what they actually look like, I'm happy to pull those slides up during the Q&A session. So we looked at recovery capital. We looked at 12-step affiliation and practices. Online recovery investment scale. This was a scale that was modified from an original scale that looked at Facebook investment. And so we literally just took the word Facebook out of the measure and added the word online recovery. And it fit our needs for what we were trying to do, which is try to assess how often people were online and how much they were invested in the online recovery space. There were some problems that came up with this measure, but we do have it in here and it was part of the study. So we will report on it. And then the last of the recovery measures, at least, were the hoping and coping in recovery. And so this is a scale that has 2 different aspects. One looks at how hopeful someone reports feeling about their recovery and life in general. And then the other is about how strong they feel their coping skills and their coping strategies are. And then covariates, so things that we felt would influence or would have some sort of impact on being involved in online recovery or in some of the responses that we're giving are general personality factors, right? So whether someone's more extroverted or more open or agreeable, and then also psychological distress. So whether or not somebody is experiencing distress symptoms. In this example, depression is cited, but there's also restlessness, irritability, that sort of thing. And then we also just wanted to capture general positive and negative affect to sort of get a sense of people's moods when they were taking the assessment, because sometimes there are implications for mood in some of these outcome measures we're looking at. So before I go into what we have found, I just wanted to touch on or just remind you of what our aims were. So we were looking at changes in outcomes as a function of support use, and we actually broke that down by length of time in recovery, which I'll show in just a moment. And then looking at online recovery use, recovery history, personality to look at who has better outcomes. And then looking at gender and age differences, and then generally just gathering information about the benefits and the challenges from the perspective of the people attending these meetings and in these spaces. So first, I'll present some of the quantitative data, which just means numerical data. So we asked open-ended questions where people could elaborate and give an explanation in their own words. And then we asked a lot of questions where people just rated or reported in number format. So this is the quantitative findings. So we found that when we asked them generally, is your home group meeting online currently? We saw the vast majority of people were part of a group that had started meeting online. And that would remain pretty stable. It actually dipped a little bit in May and June, but we think that's probably a result of things opening up a bit more in the US during those months. And so a large portion of people had their actual groups, their home group meeting online. And then an interesting trend that we saw is that people reported on average prior to COVID attending just over 3 meetings a week. And then at this baseline point here, where you see in the second data point, this is their average meeting attendance at the time that they took that first survey, and it had gone up to just above 4. And then a month later, we saw that it was increased by just a little bit more, but it was still higher than pre-COVID. So what we see is there's this, as online meetings are like new and novel, it appears that across this sample, people started going to more meetings than they had gone to previously, despite there being limited availability of their in-person meetings. But then we see in waves 2 and 3, so in June and July, late June, late July, that actually dropped off a little bit. And then we were back to fewer meetings than average meetings per week than where we started pre-COVID. And then another interesting question, responses to a question we asked, is whether or not people would continue to attend online meetings after the pandemic. And I honestly did not think that we would see numbers this high, but a lot of people in this sample indicated that they would in fact continue to attend online meetings after the pandemic. And there was a bit of an increase from April to May that was significant. And then those numbers have remained relatively stable since then. Okay, so addressing our specific aims. So recovery capital. So this is the sense that a person has access to resources to that they can draw upon when they need them. So by resources, I mean social and personal and spiritual, just a bunch of different resources, internal and external. This is a plot of the means for each of the groups that you see listed here. So this is length of time in recovery. So the blue line represents the average scores for people who have less than 1 year for recovery capital across the 4 waves. And so what we're seeing here is that the people that have the lowest recovery capital, those with less than 1 year, we actually see an increase across the first couple of waves and then a bit of a decrease. And we're not sure why. It's one of the things we'll be looking into with more sophisticated analyses. We intend to do some multi-level modeling when we get our complete data set and take a bit of a further look at this. But we see that the next line are those people from 1 to 4 years. So, and I should also state that higher scores, maybe this is a given, but I don't want to assume anything. Higher scores indicate higher levels of recovery capital, so more resources that can be drawn upon. So relatively stable across people with 5 to 20 plus years. We don't see much change across these trajectories, these different time points. This is the same sort of plot for 12-step affiliation in practices. Again, stability for people who have been in recovery for longer periods of time, which we would expect that to be the case, right? Like they've been pretty stable, relatively stable across time. But where we're seeing more increases and decreases are the people who have less than 1 year and who have between 1 and 4 years. And there has been some work that suggests that the period of time at which someone's chances of relapse, lifetime relapse, drop off pretty significantly is right around the 5-year mark. And so I think it makes sense when we think about that in context that there would be more fluctuation for people who have between 1 and 4 and less than 1 year, so that they would be a bit less stable and we would see more variation. But again, this is preliminary work and data, and we need to do a much deeper look for more specific answers and insights. And this is the hoping in recovery by length of time in recovery. And we're seeing a little bit more variation here than in others. And so there seemed to be this, at time 3, there was this point at which there was a lot more hope. We saw an increase in almost all, with the exception of people who have 20 or more years. So there was this initial dip at the 60-day mark, and then an increase at the 90-day. And this coincided when things had opened up pretty significantly. And then by the time data was being collected here in the last wave, I think things were slow, closing down a bit more. So that may have impacted the trend that we're seeing here. Again, with the most stability, the people who have been in recovery for longer periods of time. And then this is the same measure, but a different facet of the same measure. So this is the idea that people feel like they have the coping skills necessary to meet the challenges that they face in their daily lives, but also specific to recovery. And again, the yellow, or the blue and the red lines are sort of, up and down, and those are the people with under 5 years of recovery. And then we see stability for people who have longer periods of time. Okay, so looking at our second aim, which was trying to think about what things were predictive of, what personality traits, what other variables were predictive of increased well-being. And I should note that these are correlations. So these are just looking at relationships between variables. And what we see is some of the things that stood out to me as most notable here. And I have to apologize for presenting a couple of tables in a row here, but sometimes a lot of numbers can be a lot to take in. But what I found interesting is that years in recovery here at the top line at number 1, when we look down the list, it's correlated with the things that you would think it would be. So people who have more time in recovery have more, report more recovery capital. They report less psychological distress. So that's negative sign. So that means less distress. No relation with positive affect, but there is a relation with negative affect. So people who are further along in their recovery were significantly less likely to report having negative affect or negative mood. And then there was no relationship between 12-step affiliation in practice and length of time in recovery. And I'm making the assumption that these are all people who are in recovery and not in their early days, just starting out. And so no difference between or based on where they sit in their recovery. And then there wasn't any relationship with recovery investment online or hoping or coping in recovery. And then just generally, a lot of these things are correlated with each other, and that makes sense. These are all things that are very highly related, and there's separate sub-facets of recovery and processes in recovery. So what I would expect that. We will need to do some transformations when we run our main analyses in order to account for some of these highly correlated variables. With regard to personality, we looked at the big 5 personality variables. So these are the 5 most commonly assessed aspects of a person's personality. They're relatively stable over time. So they are extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to experience. And while there were quite a few things that were significantly related, I think the things that I will point out and draw your attention to is that both extroversion and agreeableness were positively related to online recovery investment. And so the more extroverted someone is, the more outgoing, the more prone they are to being social, the more likely they were to report having invested in and spending more time online and more time engaging with people in online recovery spaces, which makes sense. We would expect that to be the case. And then also just agreeableness. So how agreeable people are generally. This has a bit to do with temperament. It can also be thought of as temperament. And that was also pretty highly correlated and positively correlated with online recovery investment. I personally anticipated that openness to experience would also be correlated. My thinking there was, and again, I had not made hypotheses, but I kind of had some ideas about what we might see. And there wasn't a relationship between online recovery investment and openness to experience. My thinking was, if someone is more open to the idea of being in this space, then maybe they would be more likely to be engaged and to be online, but that's actually not what we found. So there was a relationship with recovery capital. So people who are more open to new experiences also reported having higher resources that they could draw upon in to meet their challenges. That's recovery capital generally. And they also had higher 12-step affiliation and practice, reported higher 12-step affiliation and practice. And then all of these things were, with the exception of openness, were related to decreased psychological distress. So the more extroverted, the more agreeable, the more conscientious, the more emotionally stable a person is, the fewer symptoms of psychological distress we saw from those people. When we did a specific breakdown of all of our study variables of interest by gender, so when we split the file into, and this is binary, and I do apologize for, there are many genders, not just 2, but we split it in between males and females, which were the only 2 that were represented in our study specifically. This is the same correlational table. This is just for women, and the major divergences between men versus women are highlighted here in red. So for women, positive affect was positively correlated with the length of time in recovery. So for women who were further along in their recovery, they were also more likely to report having positive mood or positive affect. And that was not the case for men. And then the further women were along in their recovery, the more they reported feeling like they were a part of, like they were affiliated, and they were practicing the 12 steps, which was not the case when we had, when we looked at either just the sample for men or when we looked at the overall sample. And then we also saw correlations that were significant between online recovery investment and positive affect, 12-step affiliation and practice, and coping in recovery. So for women, those who reported having higher online recovery investment were also higher in positive affect. They were also higher in 12-step affiliation and practices, and then their ability to cope with things that were happening in their lives. So in addition to gender, we did break the sample down by generations. And so there was a reasonable split among these three generations that we are presenting here. So we have baby boomers, Generation X, and then the net generation, also known as millennials. I've included the range of dates that are generally considered to be representative of these. And I say range because depending on what your source is, you may find the years are off by a little bit here or there. But when we broke this down, what we found is that there was and this is, all of these correlations are for online recovery investments. So this is how much people are reporting that they're spending time online, how many meetings they're attending per week, how many people they're engaging with online. So how much they're investing in the online recovery space. We found that the net generation, so the youngest subgroup in our sample, that was positively correlated with recovery capital. So the more they were spending online and investing in online recovery, the higher recovery capital they reported. We did not see that relationship for Gen X or for baby boomers. And then generally across the net generation, we saw more statistically significant correlations between online recovery investment and positive affect, 12-step affiliation and practices, hoping and coping in recovery. And that wasn't the case for people who were a bit older. And we think this is largely an impact of it being the net generation, right? So younger people just generally being more interested in tech, more comfortable with it, more familiar with it. It's always been a part of their existence, their lives at this point. And so really think that familiarity and ease and knowledge has a lot to do with these findings. But we will be looking more deeply and closely into this. So one of the other things that we were interested in is who out of these generational cohorts, who was experiencing the most psychological distress. And what we found is that the blue line represents the net generation. So these are the younger folks. And they were reporting the highest level of psychological distress symptoms. So restlessness, irritability, discontent, depression, and it drops off in between waves 2 and 3, and then sort of stabilizes. There was an increase for Generation X over the course of the study, and then got all of the baby boomers. They're just seem to be the most chill of the three groups. They seem to dip a little bit, and then a little bit of an increase in psychological distress symptoms from waves 3 to 4. Okay, so moving from our collection and reporting of the quantitative findings, or the numerical aspects of the study, and shifting gears into what people's actual experiences were, we did ask a series of questions at each time point that had to do with how people were experiencing this time in recovery, in their recovery history. So one of the questions we asked was very generally, what do you like best about online meetings? And this is a tactic that's used in a lot of studies in the topic, any topic that you want. You just generally ask the participants, what do you like best about this? And then what do you like least about this? Because then you're not leading them into any particular type of answer. You're giving them the opportunity to just express themselves. And so Brittany, name has been changed to protect anonymity for obvious reasons, with 1.5 years of recovery from the US, talks about transportation, being able to go to meetings that she wouldn't be able to access typically. So that was her, what she liked best. And then Ariana, with 12 years from Australia, talked about being able to see people and hear stories, and that it was appreciated given the difficult times. And then we had another participant from Canada, Alicia, with 3 years of recovery, who talked about the specific experience of having a child in early recovery, and being a single mom and juggling work, life, and recovery, and the balance of those things. And she appreciated being able to attend meetings with people that were familiar, but not have to leave home, get ready, go out. And so she really touched on the convenience of it for people in her particular life situation or circumstances. And in response to this question about what do people like least about online meetings, Angela, with 7 years from the US, talked about the difficulties of being a newcomer or trying to help a newcomer in this time. And that, you know, there's this period of time before a meeting and after a meeting where a lot of connections are made. And that was really hard to do. It's been hard to do in online meetings. And she also mentions the chat function, which she clearly isn't a fan of, but finds it very distracting. And then we had another person talk about, this is Christopher with 7 years of recovery, about sparsely attended meetings, seventh tradition not happening, which is the collection of donations from members that help support the, this person is in AA, the 12-step fellowships. And then Alan with 15 years, it really highlighted that he was missing the physical experience of going to meetings, driving there, getting new people, and just general lack of social engagement. So we also asked people whether or not their opinions about online meetings has changed. And this wasn't the first, this was, I think, our third wave, possibly even the fourth wave, so the most recent wave. And Mark from the US with 4 years talked about it being novel and exciting at first, and then that wearing off and just going to regular meetings. And then Candace with 37 years talks about going to a lot of in-person meetings, and then also going to different meetings, different times of day, and having the opportunity to, in this instance, give talks in places where she wouldn't have typically been, so in England. And I skimmed through a lot of the responses. I obviously can't capture everybody's response here, but some of the themes, and this is, I should be clear, this is not an actual qualitative analysis, content analysis. I haven't had enough time to do anything like that, but in skimming through and thinking about what might be useful for many of you who are here today, and some of the things that the organizers told me that you all might be interested in, I wanted to pull together some of the very common themes that I saw. So some of the challenges that were brought up pretty consistently were, with regard to personal challenges, people talked a lot about having reliable internet, or not having reliable internet rather. And frequently what was brought up is not necessarily that they don't have internet. I mean, clearly that is a separate issue, but that it was really dependent on who else was using internet at the time and what the internet speed was. And so there was discussions of that being an issue and that being frustrating. And then also whether or not the person had access to a space that was conducive to being in a meeting of recovery and being able to talk openly, not be distracted. So having a safe space or a location in their home where they could go and participate. And then the aspect of the social part of the recovery program. So the meetings before and after, the drives to the meetings, and then sponsorship were all mentioned pretty frequently about it being a challenge to meet as many people, to connect with people, either to find a sponsor or to find sponsees or to meet with the current sponsor, and just a lot of transition, a lot of changes happening in those sorts of relationships, and a lot of struggle on those points. And then, and maybe this is obvious, but there was a lot of discussion of access issues. And I should note that the study, one of the study limitations is that these were people who they clearly have access because they were recruited online. But there was discussion and talk about the concern of older members of groups and even family members who are in recovery who didn't have the same level of knowledge, who didn't have access to some of these resources. And there was even pretty detailed descriptions of ways that people were trying to circumvent the need for example, a Zoom account or that sort of skill set, expertise, and knowledge. On one instance, a woman had called another group member and patched her through, like on a three-way call, into a Zoom call so that the woman was able to be on the phone and hear the meeting. So there was some discussion of access issues with a pretty large, heavy concern on the older members of groups. And then just generally, level of comfort with technology. So Zoom bombing was talked about pretty frequently, instances where people are accessing meetings that are not, I don't want to say not invited, but they're not actually a part of a recovery group. So they're there with the intent to disturb the meeting or be distracting. And then people just not knowing how to use, oops, I went forward too far. People not knowing how to use the tech and just being generally uncomfortable with how it works, and inadvertently just random things happening that, you know, I'm sure are laughed about now, but at the time I'm sure were embarrassing. Things having to do with people being in a meeting, but also being at home and having stuff going on in the background behind them. So various levels of comfort with technology, access issues, all cited as challenges. And then benefits. There was a lot of discussion about attending meetings in other locations. There were many participants who talked about having moved in their recovery and being able to access meetings from where they previously lived and seeing people that they had not seen in a long time. There was discussion about how convenient it is. And I think this probably influenced the number of people who said that they would continue to participate in online meetings after the fact. There's a lot of talk of it not needing to drive, and it saving time, and just generally not having to leave the convenience of the home. And then that ties directly into the discussion of new parents. So I became particularly interested in this idea of parenting and the impact of everything being online and now being more readily accessible to parents who typically, you know, there's a drop off in the early years of parenthood, just out of sheer necessity to take care of a child. And I'm actually starting a study on the side of the impact of parenthood and becoming a parent, first-time parent in recovery, and how it impacts recovery and how recovery impacts being a parent. And that's very early stages, but I'm happy to talk to others about that if people are interested. Socially, some of the benefits were people talked about there being a lot of creative new ways to connect, and some people reported having new sponsorship relationships, either with sponsees or with a sponsor, and that this shift to virtual meetings has now sort of opened up people's ideas and awareness that things can potentially happen online, whereas, you know, virtual sponsorship was, I don't want to say looked down upon, but people weren't as willing to engage in that sort of interaction and those sorts of relationships in the same way that they are now. That has become a little bit more normalized. So quite a few people, several people mentioned asking people to sponsor them who lived much further away and not locally, when they would not have done so before this happened. And then on several occasions, people just generally talked about learning how to use this technology and that it was useful for other areas of their lives. So learning the online technology, the video conferencing technology, so Zoom and Teams and the other software that's being used was helpful for work purposes, but also for keeping in touch with family and friends. And then lastly, I just want to highlight an important aspect of all of the work that I do as an applied psychologist. So it's important that the work that we do in my lab translates to the community. And so I like to collect data and I like to write about it, but I also like to make sure that the people who are I'm doing this work with and the people that are involved in the study also know about what I'm finding. And often, if you're familiar with the publishing timeline, it can take up to several years after data is collected to get things out and actually published. And so one of the things that I've built into this study is making sure that people are informed. And this talk is actually one of the ways that I'm doing that. And I'm looking forward to doing more of these. But another one is that we have created an infographic that's available on our lab website, which is uwindsorpearl.ca. So we have this available. This is reflective of the first 3 waves of our data. And then we have been updating our website so you can access the most recent data, and this will be updated at least 1 or 2 more times over the course of the study. So it's available here. If you go to the lab website and then just click research, you can immediately navigate to the most recent findings. And then, of course, we'll be contributing to recovery science more generally by publishing and by presenting at some conferences and looking a bit deeper at all of the variables that we've listed here with a network of collaborators and publishing, hopefully pretty extensively on this time in recovery history. And with that, I just want to say a quick thank you to our participants. I think that there may be a few of you in the audience today, which is fantastic. And then to my lab at the University of Windsor, all of the research assistants who have helped, Matthew Meeks in particular, who was awarded a graduate training fellowship through my tax for work with me on this project over the summer. And then, of course, to all of you for listening. Thank you. And I will now take questions.
All right. So people can go ahead and put questions into the question and answer box, or you can raise your hand as well and we can unmute you to ask questions.
Typically when there's no questions, it means I nailed the talk and everything was perfectly clear. Is that the assumption? I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no.
I'm happy to answer questions about how the study was developed, about challenges, about limitations. Like there was a lot I felt like I couldn't get to. So I can also show some of those individual measures. So really open Q&A here.
Let's see, in some of our previous sessions, it was taking a minute for people to get questions and stuff typed in. So we'll give it just a second here.
Oh, yeah, no problem at all.
So I guess one question that I might have is, do you have any kind of idea of how some of these early findings might be extrapolated towards other mutual peer-to-peer support groups? And was that ever a part of, consideration when you were, designing this study?
It's a good question. I went to 12-step groups just because they're the most established and have the most meetings and the most accessibility in terms of participants. But I'm also more generally interested in the recovery journey more generally. So all different pathways. And one of the things that I did midway through this study, so I think it was our July, it was our third wave. I modified the measures a bit. So I added some measures to this survey. And then I was simultaneously collecting data in another recovery program, Recovery Dharma. And I had a similar sample size and a really similar spread in terms of length of time in recovery. And so the intent going forward is to look at similarities and differences among participants in those two groups during this time on some of these key measures like recovery capital, and obviously not 12-step affiliation and participation, but some of the other things like hope and coping and recovery. And so I'm able to make those comparisons, and I typically wouldn't take two studies and look at differences across samples, but because there's a similar number, similar length of time in recovery, and they're both peer-based mutual help programs for people in recovery, I couldn't resist the opportunity to do that. And so I did build some things into it in terms of what implications I think it has. I mean, generally big picture stuff is that younger people are definitely showing that they are using online spaces for recovery much more frequently. I think that there is much more variation for people who are earlier on in recovery, years 1 to 5, but I think that can be, those can be target areas going forward, and maybe those people stand to gain the most. And I don't know that online recovery is a good complete replacement for face-to-face, but I do think that it could be really useful for and supplemental to a primary mode of recovery, whatever pathway that might be, right? And for some of the reasons that are listed by some of the participants, so parenting, or when traveling, or people with not a lot of access. So I think there are some interesting implications, and we'll know more too as we continue gathering data and running analyses.
Thank you. Looks like a question just came in. The question says, you mentioned the study is about halfway done. Do you have any thoughts of keeping this going until the pandemic is fully resolved to see what kind of lasting impact may be?
Yeah, so I mean, I had some foresight when I was designing it, in that my initial thought was, let's let it run for at least a year, because we have no idea what this is going to look like, right? And there's going to be fluctuations, and it's possible we'll be online and without physical meetings for a while. So the original intent was 1 year. That was it will likely and hopefully be extended, but that really doesn't depend on me. That really depends on, if I can submit another application to the ethics board and get approval for an extension. And then of course I would need to ask all the participants and see if they'd be willing to continue to participate. Right now, where I've applied for several funding opportunities to increase response rates and to keep the project going. Initially was funded by startup funds and by just the great work that my graduate students and I are doing. But it takes a lot of work and a lot of money to keep things like this going. So we have our fingers crossed for the most recent grant we've applied for. But yeah, I would absolutely like to see it continue to go and collect data and have some sort of record of what people are experiencing during this time.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else in the audience have any questions? All right, I'm not seeing any other questions or anything else here.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. LaBelle. That was really great and kind of informative, and we look forward to seeing the results here in the next, couple months, and hopefully you're able to secure some more funding to extend that, because I think that would be a really interesting, snapshot of what that looks like, especially as things start to open up more and go back to whatever our new normal is going to be.
Yes, hopefully soon.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for the opportunity, Matthew, and thank you all for listening.